The wheat stalks bent under the weight of their own grain, golden waves stretching to the horizon across Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. In the corner of a field near Steele's Tavern, a young man stood beside a crude wooden contraption, part wagon, part sawmill, part monster. His hands were black with grease, his shirt soaked through with sweat in the summer heat of 1831. A crowd of farmers gathered, their weathered faces skeptical, arms crossed. They'd seen promises before. The machine lurched forward, its blade chattering against the wooden frame, wheels wobbling on uneven ground, grain scattered. The crowd murmured, "Another failure." But then something changed. The blade found its rhythm. Stalks fell in neat rows. In 1 hour, this clumsy machine had done what took a man an entire day. This wasn't just an invention. It was the beginning of a $200 million empire that would feed a nation and change the world forever. If you're already hooked on this story, consider subscribing now so you don't forget later. But could one machine really build a fortune that massive? Or was there something else driving Cyrus McCormick's rise to power? Chapter 1. The problem that broke America's back. Before the Reaper, harvest was a race against starvation. In the early 1800s, American farmers faced an impossible choice that determined whether their families would eat or go hungry. The United States was expanding westward at a breakneck pace. The Louisiana Purchase had doubled the nation's size. Settlers were flooding into territories that would become the Great Plains, some of the richest farmland on Earth. There was just one catastrophic problem: nobody could harvest fast enough. Wheat farming in the 1820s was backbreaking, sunrise to sunset labor. A farmer using a scythe or a grain cradle could harvest about 3 acres per day if he worked himself to exhaustion. That's not 3 acres per hour, 3 acres in an entire day. It took roughly 40 hours of brutal manual labor to harvest a single acre of wheat. The math was devastating. If you planted more wheat than you could harvest, it would rot in the field. Weather didn't wait. You had maybe 10 days, perhaps 2 weeks at most, when the grain was perfectly ripe. Too early, the kernels weren't mature. Too late, they'd shatter and fall to the ground, worthless. This became known as the harvest bottleneck. America had endless land. Farmers had endless ambition, but human hands and backs had limits. You simply couldn't scale up. The westward expansion was hitting a wall made of wheat stalks. Farmers were desperate. Entire communities would band together during harvest, neighbors helping neighbors, racing against rain and wind. Even then, crops were lost. Fortunes were lost. The nation's agricultural potential was being strangled by this single, unsolvable problem. Or so everyone thought. Chapter 2. 15 Years of Failure. The Father Who Couldn't Crack the Code. Robert McCormick was a man haunted by a machine that refused to work, and it was slowly destroying him. Robert was a farmer and blacksmith in Rockbridge County, Virginia. He owned a modest estate called Walnut Grove. He wasn't poor, but he wasn't wealthy either. He was comfortable, respectable, the kind of man his neighbors trusted. But Robert McCormick had a problem. He was obsessed. For 15 years, starting around 1815, Robert tried to invent a mechanical reaper. He wasn't the only one. Inventors across America and Europe were attacking the same problem, but most gave up after a few attempts. Not Robert. He was convinced he could solve it. His blacksmith shop became a laboratory of failure, prototype after prototype. Different blade designs, straight blades, curved blades, rotating blades, different cutting motions, sawing, chopping, shearing, different power sources, horses, oxen, even hand cranks. Nothing worked reliably. The problem was devilishly complex. Wheat stalks aren't uniform. They grow at different heights, different thicknesses. The ground is rarely flat. The machine had to cut close enough to get the grain, but not so close it jammed on rocks or dirt. It had to separate wheat from weeds. It had to move forward smoothly while cutting, which meant coordinating wheels, blades, and draft animals in perfect synchronization. And it had to be simple enough that a farmer, not a trained mechanic, could operate and repair it. By 1830, Robert McCormick was exhausted. He was in his 60s. He'd spent thousands of hours and significant money. His family was tired of the obsession. Finally, reluctantly, Robert admitted defeat. He gave up, but his 22-year-old son, Cyrus Hall McCormick, did not. Chapter 3. The breakthrough that changed everything, how a failed father's work became his son's fortune. Cyrus McCormick stood in his father's blacksmith shop in the summer of 1831, staring at the pieces of broken dreams scattered across the workbench. And he saw something his father had missed. Cyrus had grown up watching his father's failures. He'd worked alongside him, handed him tools, listened to the cursing when another prototype jammed or shattered. But Cyrus had a different temperament. Where his father was stubborn, Cyrus was methodical. Where Robert kept trying to make one big leap, Cyrus broke the problem into smaller pieces. The key insight was this: don't try to make the perfect machine. Make the machine that works well enough. Cyrus took his father's final design and simplified it. He added a straight, vibrating blade, like a saw moving side to side rapidly. He added a reel to bend the wheat stalks toward the blade. He added a platform to catch the cut grain. He added a divider to separate the wheat you wanted to cut from the wheat you didn't. It was crude, it was loud, it rattled and shook. But in July 1831, it worked. Cyrus arranged a public demonstration at Steele's Tavern, a local gathering spot. Farmers came from miles around, partly curious, mostly skeptical. The machine looked ridiculous. One farmer reportedly called it a right smart, curious sort of thing. Cyrus hitched a horse to the reaper and drove it into the wheat field. The crowd waited for disaster. The blade engaged. The reel turned. Wheat fell in neat swaths behind the machine. In 6 hours, Cyrus harvested 6 acres of wheat, double what the best hand cutter could do in the same time. The crowd was stunned into silence, then erupted in questions. How much did it cost? Could it handle hills? What about rocks? Cyrus had just solved the unsolvable problem, but he was smart enough to know that solving a technical problem and building a fortune were two very different things. The machine worked. Now came the hard part, convincing the world to buy it. And for that, Cyrus would need to become something his father never was: a ruthless businessman. Chapter 4. Why Virginia Wasn't Enough. The decision that turned thousands into millions. In 1847, Cyrus McCormick walked away from everything his family had built in Virginia, and it was the smartest decision he ever made. For 15 years after that first successful demonstration, Cyrus improved the reaper. He received his first patent in 1834, patent number 8277. He started manufacturing in small numbers at Walnut Grove. He sold a few dozen reapers per year to local farmers, but Virginia was the wrong market. The farms were small, the fields were hilly and rocky, hard terrain for a mechanical reaper. Most Virginia farmers grew tobacco, not wheat, and culturally, Southern farmers were slow to adopt new technology. They had enslaved labor. They didn't feel the same urgency as Northern and Western farmers who needed to maximize productivity. Cyrus realized he was thinking too small. The real opportunity wasn't in Virginia. It was in the West. The Great Plains were opening up: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa. These territories were becoming states. The land was flat, perfect for wheat. Farms were massive, hundreds, sometimes thousands of acres. These farmers desperately needed mechanical reapers. They were the future, and there was one city perfectly positioned to serve them: Chicago. In 1847, Chicago was barely a city, population around 20,000, but it sat at the intersection of everything that mattered. The Great Lakes provided water transportation. Railroads were beginning to connect it to the East Coast. And most importantly, it was surrounded by the richest farmland in America. Cyrus made the decision. He would leave Virginia, leave his family's farm, and bet everything on Chicago. He partnered with William Ogden, Chicago's first mayor, and built a factory on the north bank of the Chicago River. It was an enormous risk. He was 38 years old. He was walking away from stability into a frontier boomtown that could collapse at any moment. But Cyrus understood something fundamental. Geography is destiny. If he stayed in Virginia, he'd remain a small-time manufacturer selling dozens of reapers. If he moved to Chicago, he could sell thousands. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. By 1850, Cyrus McCormick's factory in Chicago was producing over 1,000 reapers per year. By 1860, over 4,000. The fortune was no longer theoretical. It was real, growing, and accelerating. But making a great product wasn't enough. Cyrus was about to revolutionize something even more important than the reaper itself: how you sell it. Chapter 5. The Salesman Who Invented Modern Business. How McCormick didn't just sell machines, he sold trust. Cyrus McCormick understood a truth that most inventors miss entirely. Farmers don't buy inventions, they buy solutions to problems they can't afford to gamble on. A mechanical reaper in the 1850s cost between $100 and $130. That was an astronomical sum for a farmer, roughly equivalent to $3,500 today. For most farmers, it represented months of income. If the machine didn't work, if it broke down during harvest, they could lose everything. So Cyrus didn't just sell reapers, he sold certainty. And he did it by inventing business practices that were utterly revolutionary for the time. First, the money-back guarantee. If a farmer bought a McCormick reaper and it didn't perform as advertised, Cyrus would refund the full purchase price. No questions asked. This was unheard of in the 1840s and 50s. Most manufacturers sold products as is. Buyer beware. McCormick flipped the risk. He took it onto himself. Second, payment plans. Most farmers didn't have $100 in cash sitting around. So McCormick offered credit. Pay a deposit. Take the machine. Pay the rest after harvest when you actually had money from selling your wheat. This was radical. It meant farmers with no capital could still afford the reaper. Third, warranty and field service. McCormick didn't just sell you a machine and disappear. He trained mechanics and sent them into farming regions to repair reapers on site. If your McCormick reaper broke during harvest, the worst possible time, a mechanic would come to you. You weren't stranded. Fourth, aggressive, relentless advertising. McCormick took out full-page ads in farming newspapers. He printed testimonials from satisfied customers. He created colorful, elaborate promotional materials showing the reaper in action. He organized public demonstrations and competitions, pitting his reaper against competitors' machines. Fifth, traveling salesman. McCormick built a nationwide network of sales agents. These weren't just order takers. They were evangelists. They knew farming. They could answer technical questions. They could demonstrate the reaper in the field. They turned sales into a relationship. All of this was new. McCormick didn't invent the reaper market. He invented the modern agricultural equipment industry. He created the template that companies like John Deere and International Harvester would follow for the next century. By the late 1850s, McCormick didn't just mean a reaper. It meant quality. It meant reliability. It meant a company that stood behind its product. Farmers across the Midwest would say, "I need a McCormick," the way people today say, "I need a Kleenex," or "hand me a Band-Aid." Brand loyalty, customer service, financing options. These weren't happy accidents. Cyrus McCormick engineered them deliberately because he understood that selling machines was easy. Building trust was what made you rich. And then, just as his empire was reaching critical mass, America tore itself apart. Chapter 6. The War That Made Him Millions. How the Civil War turned McCormick from wealthy into unstoppable. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Cyrus McCormick was facing potential ruin until he realized the war would do something unexpected. It would make his fortune inevitable. The outbreak of war seemed like a disaster for McCormick's business. His customer base was farmers, and farmers were being drafted into armies by the hundreds of thousands. The men who operated the reapers were going to war. Fields would go unplanted, unharvested. Who would buy reapers if there was nobody to use them? But Cyrus understood something the pessimists didn't. The reaper didn't replace farmers. It multiplied them. Before the war, a farmer using a scythe could harvest 3 acres a day. With a McCormick reaper, that same farmer could harvest 12 acres. Suddenly, one farmer could do the work of 4. Women, older men, boys too young to fight. They could operate the reaper. The machine didn't require strength or experience. It required someone to drive the horse and manage the mechanism. The North faced a strategic problem. How do you feed an army of 500,000 men while your agricultural workforce is depleted? The answer was mechanization. The McCormick Reaper became a weapon of war, not on the battlefield, but in the wheat fields of Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. The Union government didn't explicitly endorse the McCormick Reaper, but it didn't have to. Market forces took over. Northern farmers bought reapers at unprecedented rates. Production at McCormick's Chicago factory exploded. In 1861, he sold over 4,000 reapers. By 1864, production had more than doubled. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton reportedly said the reaper was worth more to the Union cause than a regiment of soldiers. Whether he actually said it or not, the sentiment was accurate. The North's ability to feed itself and its army while maintaining agricultural exports to Europe, generating desperately needed foreign currency, was directly tied to mechanical harvesting. Meanwhile, the South, which had been slower to adopt reaper technology and relied more heavily on manual labor, struggled. Food shortages became a critical factor in Confederate defeat. Cyrus McCormick's revenue during the Civil War years was staggering. Estimates suggest he was bringing in over $1 million annually in sales by the mid-1860s, roughly $30 to $40 million in today's money per year. By the time the war ended in 1865, McCormick wasn't just wealthy. He was one of the richest men in America. And he was just getting started. Chapter 7. The rival who nearly destroyed him. When your biggest threat isn't the market, it's the man copying you. Cyrus McCormick spent decades building an empire, but one man nearly tore it all down, and his name was Obed Hussey. Obed Hussey was a Baltimore inventor who developed his own mechanical reaper. The problem? He developed it around the same time as McCormick. Both men filed patents in the 1830s. Both claimed to be the original inventor. Both believed the other was a fraud. The legal battle between McCormick and Hussey became one of the most bitter patent disputes in American history. It lasted for decades. Courtrooms, testimonies, dueling newspaper ads. Both men accused the other of stealing designs. Hussey's Reaper was different from McCormick's. His blade design was arguably better in some conditions, but the core concept was similar enough that the question of who invented it first became enormously important. Patent rights meant monopoly rights. The winner would control the market. The loser would be reduced to irrelevance. McCormick fought ruthlessly. He hired top lawyers. He leveraged his wealth and political connections. He attacked Hussey's credibility in print. He undercut Hussey's prices. When Hussey tried to demonstrate his Reaper at competitions, McCormick's agents would be there, heckling, challenging, creating doubt. The courts eventually sided mostly with McCormick, though Hussey was allowed to continue manufacturing. But the legal victories didn't matter as much as the market victories. McCormick simply outsold Hussey. Better marketing, better financing options, better distribution network. Hussey, brilliant inventor that he was, never figured out the business side. He died in 1860, tragically in a train accident, still bitter about McCormick's success. McCormick attended the funeral. Whether out of respect or to make sure his rival was truly gone, no one knows. But Hussey wasn't McCormick's only competitor. There were dozens of others. Small manufacturers across the Midwest tried to build Reapers. Some made decent machines. None could compete with McCormick's brand dominance. John Deere, who started as a blacksmith making plows, eventually entered the Reaper market. Competitors emerged in Europe. British and French manufacturers tried to break into American markets. McCormick fought them all. Sometimes, with innovation, he continually improved the Reaper, adding features, increasing durability. Sometimes, with price wars, he'd slash prices in certain regions to drive competitors out, then raise them again once the threat was gone. Sometimes with legal action, suing over patent infringement, real or imagined. By 1870, the McCormick name was synonymous with Reapers. Competitors existed, but they were second tier. If you were a serious farmer, you bought a McCormick. The brand had won, And Cyrus, now in his 60s, was preparing to hand over an empire worth tens of millions of dollars to the next generation. Chapter 8. The Fortune and the Legacy. What do you do with $200 million when you're the man who fed a nation? By the 1870s, Cyrus McCormick was worth an estimated $10 to $15 million, the equivalent of $200 million or more in today's currency. And he was determined to spend it in ways that would outlast him. McCormick's lifestyle reflected his wealth. He built a mansion on Rush Street in Chicago, one of the most prestigious addresses in the city. He married Nancy Nettie Fowler, a woman 26 years his junior, from a prominent New York family. Nettie was educated, cultured, deeply religious, and ambitious. She pushed Cyrus into Chicago's high society and philanthropy circles. The McCormicks became Chicago royalty. They hosted dinners for politicians, industrialists, and clergy. They donated heavily to the Presbyterian Church. Cyrus was devoutly religious and saw his wealth as a responsibility from God. He funded the construction of churches, seminaries, and schools. He also expanded internationally. McCormick exhibited his Reaper at the 1855 Paris Exposition and won the grand prize. European audiences were stunned. American ingenuity was outpacing European manufacturing. McCormick opened sales offices in London, Paris, and other major cities. The Reaper became a global product, but Cyrus McCormick was not an easy man. He was demanding, controlling, and deeply suspicious of anyone who might challenge him. He micromanaged his business. He alienated partners. He was, by many accounts, cold and difficult to work with. In 1884, Cyrus McCormick died at the age of 75. He left behind a fortune, a business empire, and a complicated personal legacy. His son, Cyrus McCormick Jr., took over the company. Cyrus Jr. was more diplomatic than his father, more willing to collaborate. In 1902, he orchestrated a merger that would change everything. The McCormick Harvesting Machine Company merged with 4 of its largest competitors to form the International Harvester Company. It was one of the biggest corporate consolidations in American history. International Harvester became a behemoth, producing not just reapers, but threshers, tractors, trucks, and eventually a full range of agricultural and industrial equipment. At its peak, International Harvester was one of the largest corporations in the world. The McCormick name remained on products for decades. Even today, agricultural equipment bears the legacy of that 1831 Reaper. But the real legacy wasn't the company. It was what the Reaper made possible. Chapter 9. The Machine That Changed the World. One invention didn't just build a fortune, it built a superpower. The McCormick Reaper didn't just make one family rich, it fundamentally altered the trajectory of the United States and global agriculture in ways that still shape the world today. Before the Reaper, America's westward expansion was limited by labor. You could claim land, but you couldn't work it efficiently. The Reaper broke that limitation. Suddenly, a family with a few hundred acres could harvest efficiently. The Great Plains, millions of acres of rich soil, became economically viable. American wheat production exploded. In 1840, the U.S. produced about 84 million bushels of wheat. By 1860, it was 173 million. By 1900, over 500 million bushels. The Reaper was the catalyst. This had geopolitical consequences. America became the breadbasket of the world. During European famines and conflicts, American wheat fed nations. This agricultural dominance translated into economic and political power. The Reaper also freed labor. If one farmer could do the work of 4, that meant 3 people could leave the farm and work in factories, build railroads, populate cities. The Industrial Revolution in America was powered in part by agricultural mechanization. The Reaper and the factory were partners in progress, and the influence didn't stop at American borders. The principles McCormick pioneered, mechanization, standardization, mass production, customer financing, after-sales service, became the foundation of modern agribusiness worldwide. Today, combine harvesters, the descendants of McCormick's crude 1831 Reaper, harvest wheat fields in Ukraine, Australia, Argentina, and Canada. The global wheat trade feeds billions, and it all traces back to a young man in a Virginia field who refused to accept that harvesting grain by hand was the only way. Cyrus McCormick died wealthy, but his true fortune wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in the millions of people who didn't starve because wheat could finally be harvested fast enough to feed a growing world. From a blacksmith shop in Rockbridge County to the fields that feed the planet, that's the McCormick Empire. Outro. The McCormick fortune was built on solving one problem: how to harvest wheat faster than human hands could manage. But the solution didn't just create wealth, it created abundance.